Welcome to the Holy Post. If you live in a part of the country that was originally settled by Puritans or Quakers, you're probably going to live a lot longer than if you live in a region colonized by the Scots, the Irish, or that was dominated by slavery. A new article explores why this is true, and we discuss how immigration patterns from 200 years ago even impacts how you read the Bible. Then UK broadcaster, speaker, and host of the Unbelievable podcast, Justin Brierley, is back to discuss his new book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. In it, he shows how the same political divisions and culture war issues that are dividing the church have also ruptured the New Atheism movement, and how that's leading more academics and intellectuals to reconsider the claims of Christianity. All of that, plus the internet prevents dementia, and what books can we still burn in Denmark? Beyond just today's show, we also have a bunch of new content this week. There's a new Holy Post Explainer video about whether Christians must obey the government based on Romans 13. We're releasing an extra interview with a Christian filmmaker who makes horror movies. And at the end of today's news segment, we have a trailer for a brand new Holy Post sub-series that's launching later this month that we're really excited about. And of course, there's always tons of new content exclusively for Holy Post Plus subscribers. So to learn more about all of this stuff, go to holypost.com. Here is episode 582.
Hey there, this is Phil. Welcome back to the Holy Post Podcast. I'm here with Caitlin Chess. Hi, Caitlin.
Hi, Phil.
And Skywalker. That's what it says on your screen. It says Skywalker. Sky. Is that your middle name? That would be great if that was your middle name. Skywalker Jatani.
Yeah. It is not my middle name, Phil. You know my middle name.
I do know it, but I'm going to pretend that that's it because I like that so much better.
Okay.
Okay. And Caitlin Padme Chess. Okay. Probably not. And she doesn't know what that means.
I have no idea what that means.
She doesn't know what that means. And now it's time for the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. Sky and Phil and the Holy Post.
And sometimes Caitlin.
This episode of the Holy Post is sponsored by Faithful Counseling. In my 50 years on this earth, life has thrown me more than a few curveballs. The loss of a dream, rough spots in relationships, challenges in parenting. Even though friends and family and strangers on Facebook are always ready with advice, my wife Lisa and I have found it tremendously helpful to sit down with a professional therapist. And you can too. Faithful Counseling can help you find a therapist that works for you. With more than 3,000 licensed therapists across all 50 states, it's easy and free to change counselors until you find the right fit. Plus, it's more affordable than traditional in-office counseling, and financial aid is available. Whether you're struggling with family conflicts, trauma, anxiety, stress, or depression, Faithful Counseling can match you with a Christian therapist who can help. Continue growing into the best version of yourself. Visit faithfulcounseling.com/holypost and get the professional, faith-based counseling you need. They've even got a special offer for our listeners. Right now, you can get 10% off your first month at faithfulcounseling.com/holypost. And thanks again to Faithful Counseling for sponsoring this episode. Caitlin, your book's out. How's it going?
Good.
Yeah?
It's good.
Is it racing up the charts because of all the controversy?
No, hopefully not because of
Is
all
there
the
controversy? Is anyone angry at you yet?
Well, I didn't think so. And then the other day on Instagram, someone else posted about the book and it brought out the people that were angry.
Really?
It was the first time I've seen the really scary, angry people about it.
Were they angry about anything in the book, or were they just angry
no,
at
they
the
had not
idea
read
of-
it. No.
Okay. Oh.
No.
What were they angry about?
Yeah.
I think they just assumed it was a leftist book.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Because of your leftiness?
Because, yeah. I'm associated
You're a
with
woman
y'all.
at
Very
Duke?
lefty.
Oh, yeah.
A young woman from Duke who may or may not have preached a sermon or two.
Right. One of the responses was, "Why is a woman even telling me anything about any of this?"
Oh, that's nice.
Wow.
That's nice.
So,
yeah.
But you know what is nice? I am teaching a Sunday school at my church for the fall about the book. So there are good people too that are excited about it.
Any males over the age of 8?
Almost entirely, yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I'll look the other way, Caitlin. I'll just look the other way.
Thank you, Phil.
Is there any?
Didn't notice.
Is there any chance that class you're teaching will be recorded?
I don't think so. No. Just for my church. It's just a gift.
That's not fair.
No, it's a good thing.
That's not. Will you come and do it at my church, Caitlin?
No.
Man. Okay. This is big news. Older adults who regularly use the internet. Okay. Picture in your mind. Older adults who regularly use the internet have half the risk of dementia compared to non-regular users. And twice the risk of believing that wildfires are started by Jewish space lasers. So it's kind of a trade-off.
Yeah. It's like, do you need dementia if you are getting nonsense from the internet?
Okay. A longitudinal study of a large group of older adults showed that regular internet use Regular internet users had approximately half the risk of dementia compared to their same age peers who did not use the internet regularly. The difference remained even after controlling for education, ethnicity, sex, generation, and signs of cognitive decline at the start of the study. Participants, now this is interesting, participants using the internet between 6 minutes and 2 hours per day had the lowest risk of dementia. People that didn't use it at all had a higher risk of dementia, and people that used it more than 2 hours a day had a higher risk of dementia.
Who's using it 2 hours per day? I feel like most people are using it more than 2 hours per day.
Who's using it 6 minutes a day? It's just the person who can't remember where they parked their car and dropped a pin somewhere.
Yeah, is there kind of a confirmation bias in this? Because if people have significant cognitive decline, they're probably not using the internet, especially of that generation, because they don't know how.
But they checked them beforehand. They had to not have cognitive decline. And it was a long study. It started in 2002 and went all the way to 2018.
Oh, wow, I feel because the internet in 2002 was very, very different.
Who was using the internet in 2002? Well, I was, but,
not me.
Caitlin wasn't born.
I was born,
she couldn't use
but I was not using the internet. I do wonder, though, if they compare this to any other activities that require you to use your brain. Because I wonder if it's just describing the fact that people who learn new skills and interact with people have a lower chance of dementia.
Yeah. It would be interesting to compare it to TV use. Mm-hmm. Like how much TV did they watch? And does more TV actually encourage dementia? Less TV but we don't have all that information, so we can only speculate. And what about gardening?
Are we supposed to then be encouraging the elderly to be on the internet more to avoid dementia? Because there's also been studies that show they're more susceptible to the nonsense on the internet because they don't quite realize how much garbage is out there.
Hey, look, Grandma, Tucker Carlson has a show on Twitter. He's back. Twitter is gone, so I don't even know what I'm talking about. Twitter has gone crazy. It's just gone crazy. I don't know what to do anymore.
Is anyone else eager? I'm waiting for Threads to have a desktop version because I don't typically do social media on my phone.
Oh.
And
so you're the
right
guy.
Now it doesn't have a
You're the one guy.
What?
That doesn't do social media on your phone.
That's so healthy, Sky. Good for you.
I don't like typing with my thumbs. I just
weird.
I'm not dexterous.
Yeah, you could try using your nose.
It's weird. You're the only generation that does type with your thumbs. We all learned a full keyboard,
you should
with
see
fingers.
My wife type with her thumbs. She is amazing.
See,
I'm no good.
Oh.
I can't do it.
Well, that's why you need to hire an assistant, a virtual assistant who does all your thumb typing for you. Mm-hmm. Okay.
But anyway, once Threads is on desktop, I think I'm done with Twitter.
But how many people are on Threads that are actually using it?
I mean,
what's the point of tweeting if no one listens? When a tree tweets in the woods and no one's around, does it make a noise? No.
Like Elon Musk is bothering me more and more.
Yeah,
the stuff that's coming across my feed on Twitter is more and more disturbing.
Yeah.
Like it's just deteriorating really quickly.
Yeah. When I switch over to tweets for you, stuff that we think you will like, it's now up to about 80% Christian nationalism.
Really?
It just keeps getting higher and higher. Yeah. Because I'll click on it. It's like, okay, what's going on here? And then they say, oh, he really likes Christian nationalism stuff. We're looking for some more Doug Wilson to throw at him. Let's look for some more this guy to throw at him. It's like, oh, man. The whole world, I just see the whole world as being full of Christian nationalists now. I'm afraid to go outside. I won't go to the store anymore. Speaking of Christian nationalism, Denmark to ban public burning of the Bible and the Quran. The Danish government is proposing a law that would make it illegal to destroy or desecrate any holy book in Denmark. The law comes on the heels of a string of recent public burnings of the Quran by anti-Islamic activists, which sparked diplomatic protests and violent demonstrations in Muslim countries. The law is not just about the Quran, though, but pertains to any holy book. Okay?
How do they define a holy book?
A book that someone thinks is here's what they say. The Danish center-right government intends to extend Denmark's existing ban on burning foreign flags. You can't burn foreign flags in Denmark. Yeah.
Can you burn Danish flags?
Can you cook Danishes? On burning foreign flags by also prohibiting improper treatment of objects of significant religious significance. Wow, that's a significant religious significance to a religious community.
That's redundant.
Any from the Department of Redundancy Department.
This is yet another reason why I am proud to be an American, because I can desecrate whatever I want.
Proud to be an American where at least I know I'm free. Caitlin, you didn't like that answer very much.
It's true, though. That's the First Amendment.
What's going on in that political, theological brain of yours?
I don't have a strong feeling about this law. I do think it's interesting as the question that Sky asked about kind of where you draw the line. There is going to be some acknowledgement at some point that there has to be, I think, probably some communal element. I mean, the language that you used was of some religious tradition. So I think that kind of pushes against a lot of our assumptions about religion nowadays, which is that it's kind of personal, individual, spiritual, not that it comes from a community and a tradition. And it's interesting that it sounds like that language is kind of pushing us to realize that part of what makes certain symbols meaningful is the community and the tradition, not just the significance I put on it.
Yeah, like there are some countries, I think the UK is one of them, that has officially recognized Jedi as a religion, and
You can't burn Star Wars films.
I would gladly burn the prequels and the sequel movies.
Nope, can't do it.
Every week.
Going to jail in Denmark. The Danes will come and get you and take you back to Denmark to jail you. This story was pointed out by the Holy Post pundit Michael Bird, who was writing about it. And he said, is this the reintroduction of blasphemy laws? And would it apply to burning the book Dianetics by L. Ron Hubbard, which is the holy text of Scientology? Can I burn Ayn Rand books?
Yeah, or like Stephen Colbert is a disciple of J.R.R. Tolkien and builds his life around Lord of the Rings. Can we burn Lord of the Rings? Not that I would. It's a great.
No, not that I would. Not that I would.
No. I would not. I would not. I actually like
many other books I burn regularly, but not Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. So, I understand why they're doing it, because they're trying to prevent
tolerance. Sky.
Yeah,
they're
trying
tolerance.
Yes, but where do you draw the line? Which is why, again, I am in favor of the American standard, which is the government should not prevent us from freedom of expression, even if we find that expression offensive to someone else. It's just, that's why you can burn a flag in America, including an American flag. That's why you can burn a Bible or a Quran or a Bhagavad Gita or the prequel and sequel series of Star Wars, which deserve to be burned with fire daily.
Caitlin looks like she has something to say.
Well, I just think it's a good example of, as Sky was kind of alluding to, the limits of tolerance in the sense of, hypothetically, especially if a law is passed in response to acts that on a moral level, we would say, yeah, I mean, the kind of anti-Islamic action and like that's reprehensible. There was some actual real prejudice and maybe potentially inciting of harm against people that's going on. And so you would say that's really bad. But then you get into more complicated things like the L. Ron Hubbard example, where part of what's going on is not just, oh, well, this is something I don't like, but it's someone saying, I'm trying to make a really strong statement about something I think harms other people, which in our own, I mean, in not in our country as often, but especially in like European countries, there's been a lot of questions about head coverings for women, of like some people saying this is religious expression and other people saying, no, I think that harms women and so it shouldn't be allowed, which does, I think to me, it's another reminder of the decisions that we make about how we're structuring our common life together cannot avoid deeper questions of purpose and meaning, because we're always pushing up against this question of like, what is harm, and how we determine what harm is often then determines how we think about tolerance, because there's obviously things that we won't tolerate if we think it actually causes harm to people.
Yeah. Did you see the video that was circulating online of the outraged pastor strapping a Bible to a baseball bat and smashing a Barbie
Sky, did you really not see
with
this?
it? Did you not see it?
Oh, yeah.
So
The
he was
Barbie
protesting
thing,
the
right.
Barbie movie. So he
No, he wasn't.
He wasn't?
It was before the Barbie movie.
It was?
He was
What
doing
was
a
he
sermon
protesting?
about the American dream and used the Bible to whack a Barbie house. The Barbie house was like representing the American dream.
Oh, I thought he was protesting the Barbie
So it was like an
movie.
anti-consumerism.
Yeah, but it also strapped a
wow.
Bible onto a baseball bat
Right,
to
so
destroy a toy.
Would he get arrested in Denmark for desecrating a Bible? I don't think you can
That's a question.
Or a Barbie dream house.
beat up. You'd get arrested in Malibu.
Yeah, well, like, can you burn Mein Kampf? Which for like Nazi skinheads is some kind of
Yes, because we don't
important-
care about offending them. There are some people it's okay to offend,
But
mostly
but
Nazis.
this is exactly the point: is when you give the government that kind of authority, the
Yeah.
government then is in the role of determining what's offensive and what is not. And I think the
Okay.
First Amendment and the framers of the Constitution, at least the Bill of Rights, were wise enough to recognize that in a diverse, pluralistic society, that's a role beyond what the government should be doing.
It doesn't mean there aren't consequences. They're just not legal consequences.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, and if you're a private institution, if you're a private business, of course you can regulate what speech is allowed in your premises or whatever. But for the federal government to be doing that is a step too far. And I appreciate that, because that's an environment in which, yes, offensive ideas will be expressed, but what one person finds offensive, another person finds liberating or innovative or virtuous. So we in a pluralistic society, you have to have a high degree of tolerance of things that you find offensive. So
Okay.
I get why Denmark's doing that, but I don't think it works here.
Okay.
And I'm glad it hasn't been tried.
Okay, Danish authorities, Sky will be calling shortly to straighten you out. So stand by the phone and wait. Mm-hmm. He's calling. And probably not Caitlin, because she's not quite as riled up about it.
I just think it's really important. I just think it's really important
I'm moving
to
on,
say.
Caitlin. You're on the side of the Danes
Listen,
as far as I'm concerned.
trying to keep Sky from getting canceled. Okay, that's all I'm trying to do. No.
I'm not canceling it. My whole point is no one should be canceled.
I know. Well,
No one should be burned.
yeah, but other people can still cancel you.
Right, yeah,
I just think it's important to make really clear that desiring that legal framework is very different than saying, well, just because we can't determine on like a federal level what is truly harmful or offensive or wrong and not, doesn't mean that those categories don't exist and aren't meaningful for us to make judgments about.
Sure. Yeah.
I just think that's important.
There's a lot of horribly offensive, evil speech
Right.
out there that I find reprehensible and makes my blood boil and my stomach churn. I just don't think it's the federal government's role to be determining winners and losers in the realm of speech. That's all.
But is burning, is that speech or is that just keeping warm?
It's expression. It's a form of
We've
expression.
already dealt with that.
What? Oh, okay. Moving on. Long story in Politico last week. America's surprising partisan divide on life expectancy. This is interesting if you have time to read it. It is from Colin Woodard. Colin Woodard is the author of a book that we covered a couple years ago called American Nations, A History of the 11 Rival Regional Cultures of North America. And his point in that book that we talked about, and I don't have the episode number, but that America really has never been one country. He divided up into 11 different cultures based on immigration patterns. Who settled what area and what were the factors that they brought to that area? He says the true life expectancy in America the truth of life expectancy in America is that places with comparable profiles, similar advantages, and similar problems have widely different average life outcomes depending on what part of the country they belong to, and that the standard divisions of the West, the Midwest, the North, the South aren't accurate. His division, there are 9 large regions that have populations ranging from 13 to 63 million, including Yankeedom. And there's a big difference. Yankeedom is kind of the whole from the north east of the U.S., from Minnesota through Wisconsin, across northern Michigan, and then the New England states. New Netherland is the area right around New York City. Tidewater is the southeastern coast. Greater Appalachia is 59 million people. Actually, the biggest chunk of America he considers Greater Appalachia, which is, the Appalachian region going west, and those people then moved west and settled all throughout the southern Midwest, and then the Deep South. And what he discovered, as they're looking at this analysis, what they're discovering is that the same level of poverty, the same level of income, the same age levels have different life expectancy outcomes based on basically how red the area is that they live in. The reason the U.S. has strong regional differences is precisely because our swath of the North American continent was settled in the 17th and 18th centuries by rival colonial projects that had very little in common, often despised one another, and spread without regard for today's state or even international boundaries, because some of them were coming up from Mexico at the time. These colonial projects, Puritan-controlled New England, the Dutch settled area around what is now New York City, the Quaker-founded Delaware Valley, the Scots Irish-dominated upland backcountry of the Appalachians. I learned how to say that correctly recently. The West Indies-style slave society in the Deep South and the Spanish project in the Southwest had different religious, economic, and ideological characteristics, and they settled much of the eastern half and southwestern third of what is now the U.S., all before the 1840s. So his belief is that they laid down the institutions, the cultural norms, and ideas about freedom, social responsibility, and the provision of public goods that later arrivals would encounter and by and large assimilate to. So this is why we have very different attitudes in different parts of the country. For example, like, what is the role of the federal government? Should we be helping people or just letting people pull themselves up by their bootstraps? How do we view helping the poor? How do we, race relations, ideas about authoritarianism in the Deep South, which he says were largely shaped by Barbadian slavers that were developing plantation society. Is very highly authoritarian. And that it was much more focused on, we are a republic, not a democracy, which you hear a lot today. This isn't about everyone getting a vote. This is about a representation of the people that should be doing the representing, which is us. And so what they've discovered is that has tremendous influence on how well you do and how long you live. There are enormous gaps between the regions that don't go away when you parse by race, income, education, urbanization, or access to quality medical care. They amount to, and this is one of the conclusions, a rebuke to generations of elected officials in the Deep South, Greater Appalachia, and New France, which is the French area of Louisiana and Mississippi, most of whom have been Republicans in recent decades who have resisted investing tax dollars in public goods in health programs. So where you have the most kind of authoritarian or laissez-faire politics kind of come out of this authoritarianism, which says we're not going to help people that much. You help yourself. You pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And you see that largely in the areas that were settled by people in the backwoods that wanted the government to just leave them alone, and people in the South that wanted to set up plantation societies.
So in one part of this article, if I remember it correctly, they compared a county in, I think, South Carolina and a county in California, Northern California. And the two counties had very similar levels of wealth, education, both very, very white in ethnicity. So in all these different socioeconomic factors, they were identical, but the life expectancy in the South Carolina county was dramatically lower than the almost identical looking county in California, and they attribute that to the social structure of and the governmental structures and things like that. So that's really kind of weird.
Yeah.
Because we usually assume it's a matter of race, economics, or education that are the most determining factor of quality of life, but they're saying no, that's not it.
Your health is only 10% influenced by the medical environment you're in, and maybe 20 or 30% by your behavioral choices. And this is a doctor speaking, Wisconsin's top public health official. The social and political determinants of health are overwhelmingly the social and political determinants of health are overwhelming what you're seeing in these maps. So areas that have much less investment in public hospitals, much less investment in social safety nets for the poor, have much lower outcomes, and those tend to be then propagated through the years by just the similar mindset of that area, that we don't help people, people help themselves. Caitlin, what'd you think?
I just think it's interesting. I mean, I'm sure there are probably people historians or other scholars who might disagree with his particular partitioning out of the country, and also the directness of this tie between these early colonies and the cultures that exist today. But I think it's so interesting the way that you just described it. I think you were quoting from the article about people moving there, but kind of assimilating to the culture. Like, even though there's not just been an unbroken stream of generations there, they've maintained some of these cultural distinctives. I think it's such a good reminder that so many of the ideas that we have about what kind of creatures humans are, what kind of communities we should live in, what's ultimately good and right, come from the place that we're born in and are not as original to our own ideas as we think. We're not unbiased. We're not blank slates. The whole time I was reading this, I kept thinking about the number of conversations I have with people in churches about what the Bible says about wealth and poverty, and how often they'll read a verse and just go, well, obviously it means this. And then what I hear back from them, their summary that they think is just a plain summary of that chapter or verse, clearly seems to me to be shaped by their presuppositions about wealth and poverty and humans and how our community should function. But it's so hard to see that in ourselves because that's the community that you're in and the way that you're shaped. It's really hard to overcome that bias or see that bias in yourself, even if you might be able to identify it in other people. Yeah.
And what's wild is, for example, the poorest quarter of U.S. counties in Yankeedom, which is the very upper Midwest and then the New England area, have longer lifespans than the wealthiest quarter of counties in the Deep South. So the poorest people in one area of the country tend to live longer than the wealthiest people in the Deep South, where you had much less investment in social safety nets. It's really interesting how much that affected. Also, that states that have expanded Medicaid eligibility have seen significant reductions in premature deaths than those that have not seen increases. And as of the time this story was written, the 11 states that still haven't expanded the state implemented program, all but 2 of those states are in the Deep South or Greater Appalachia.
So, you know what this reminds me of is, I don't know if you guys saw this, but there was a report that came out recently ranking the most dangerous cities in America.
Yeah.
And not just for gun violence or murder, but just violent crime per capita. And there's so much rhetoric, I think, ever since remember that Try That in a Small Town song that came out a couple months ago? Everyone's talking about it. So there's this reputation that cities like Chicago, New York, pick your more industrial northern cities, are like the dangerous, horrible places. And this study just came out, and 6 of the 10 most dangerous cities in America are all in the Deep South. And a lot of them are not big cities.
Right,
number one most dangerous city in America is Bessemer, Alabama. And number 2, Monroe, Louisiana. So number 3, Saginaw, Michigan. Again, not big cities. These are not the ones that come to mind when you think of where's the worst places to live. But our perception is so skewed because of cultural assumptions and rhetoric that we think it's the giant urban city centers that are going to be most dangerous.
What I find interesting, and brings it back more to what we're about at the Holy Post, is in those different areas, the same attitudes toward social safety nets and the same attitudes that grew up in these different areas also affect the church. And what's the gospel? And what's the role of the church? And what are Christians supposed to do? And so he talks about, like in Yankeedom, it was the idealism of the Puritans, and that they were trying to create a better society where everyone could be could do well and live the way God wants us to live. And so there was just much more the idea that we invest in each other, and we all kind of invest together to bring up everybody, the common man. And then in the far south, it was very different in that we were plantation owners that were trying to maintain a social order, that the wealth goes to the ones on top and not the ones on the bottom. And so that, kind of egalitarianism versus the authoritarianism, we're now seeing a lot in the church, in terms of conflicts, whether it's, there's a natural order, and it's men, particularly if you look at the pictures, white men are on top, and then there's an ordering of everything below that, women, and then, children under my umbrella, which is, much more of a Southern concept in that plantation mentality, as opposed to the let's help everybody, let's pick our brother and sister up, let's all be equal, which was more of the Puritan ideal.
Yeah, but I think it goes even further than that, and it goes to the heart of what we think the message of the gospel is. Because a lot of Southern Christianity hyper-emphasizes individual salvation.
Yeah.
Right? You make a commitment to Jesus Christ, and he transforms your heart, your life, but there's no vision for how that then spreads to the social dimension of being human. Whereas Northern Christianity, historically from Northern Europe as well, and the Scandinavian countries and other kind of more reformed, even Calvinistic teachings, highly emphasize the transformation of society and even the inclusion, like infant baptism. I know this sounds kind of strange to connect to this, but Caitlin, this is your territory. Like the idea of covenant community, that you can welcome a child into the church and even baptize that child as part of the covenant community, is a more collectivist understanding of salvation and belonging to the people of God, versus adult baptism, which is a hyper individualistic personal decision kind of Christianity. And that's separated by these different regions that you talk about, the background of colonialism and where different immigrants came from. But it was very conducive to racial segregation in the South, because a Southern gospel that emphasized personal salvation alone rather than societal transformation was a way of both, quote unquote, being Christian,
Right,
without actually dismantling slavery.
right. And it's troubling, because as some of the North and the Northeast and New England, churches were more and more, the influence of Christianity in America is coming from the Deep South and the Bible Belt, where Christianity is becoming much more associated with authoritarianism and God's created order, and much less about bringing up everyone together and trying to create a God's just society on earth. So it's really the influence of the Southern Baptist Convention in spreading. There are Southern Baptist churches all over the country now, and that's part of kind of the when you can find the Confederate battle flags for sale in Michigan, that Southern culture has become an export. It's with Cracker Barrel and Confederate flags and NASCAR. And that Christianity is wrapped all up in that. Christianity is so wrapped up in Cracker Barrel and NASCAR and football from Texas, and that's what I'm trying to figure out, how do we separate it? How do you, like a little yeast in the leaven, what do we do?
But don't you think, if we can kind of project forward, a lot of immigration over the last 50 years has been from Latin America, Asia, Africa, and a lot of those immigrants coming in are also Christian, but they're not bringing with them Southern evangelical Christian culture.
Right, but the Southern evangelicals want to keep them out. They want to shut down immigration entirely.
Well, we have an explainer video coming in the next number of weeks about immigration and race and all that. People can look forward to it. But I think it's more that white Southern evangelical culture is trying to hold on to something that demographics are not going to preserve. And so they feel threatened by it, and they're really, really hunkering down and trying to preserve it. But I'm not sure that's the kind of Christianity that's going to really win out in the long run, given cultural, demographic, and immigration trends in the United States.
Yeah, but that kind of Christianity also could have more, political influence, like you see the far right in Europe having more political influence, where you've got people that are mad about immigration, they're mad about the loss of cultural power of white Americans, and that becomes associated with we're trying to preserve the old time faith, which is how you can have people say we don't want any more immigration from Mexico, even though they're Christians. We want America to be more Christian, but we don't want Christian immigrants. We only want native-born Christians. Okay, Caitlin, you know so much about political history and theology and everything else.
No.
Botany,
everything,
taxidermy.
Else.
Help us out.
Can I say something about the Bible?
What's the Bible? Does that have something to
Well,
do with?
When I was reading this article earlier, especially the part where it talked about how even wealthy people in these areas that have lower life expectancies are affected by that. Like, your position socially does not save you from the fact that the social system that you have created politically will cause harm to you. It was such a picture to me. I think it reminded me of the book, The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee, that talked about the ways that policies, especially in the South, harmed white people too. This is like the classic example being, you don't want to desegregate your pool, so you shut down all the public swimming pools. Now no one gets a public swimming pool.
Yeah,
and to me, that's actually, like, this could be a great way if you're someone who's hearing everything Phil said that sounds really bad, and you're like, I know those people in my church who feel that way about immigration, they feel that way about the changing culture, they've tied their Christianity to these particular expressions that might not even be their own. They might be in Michigan and not in the South. I think one way into this is a good article to have a conversation about that, but I think the better way too would be to connect something like this dynamic that you can see data about, and connect it to something like the biblical description that Sky and I fought about recently in Jeremiah 29, where the exiles are told not only to care for the community that they are exiled in, to seek the peace and prosperity of the city that their captors have built, but it says that, like, in their prosperity in their peace you will find your peace. There is this principle that is not just seen in data, but is actually revealed to us in Scripture, that your community is bound up with one another, that it's not possible, really, even though you might momentarily think you can elevate yourself at the expense of others, ultimately your good is bound up in the good of your larger community. And so even if you have inherited these kind of cultural ideals about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, and this kind of authoritarianism, and this concern that, says that the wealthy have deserved it and are more moral, righteous people, and the poor just need to get their act together, they're actually, not only are there plenty of biblical commands about the poor and the wealthy that contradict that, but there's also this principle that by common grace we see in the data, but we also see in Revelation, that our community's goods are always bound up with one another's, and we have to figure out a way to work together, even across difference, even if you can't bridge every divide, even if there are still people that you have a prejudice or bias against. This is an important command for all communities to say, across those divides, your good is bound up with each other's goods. You shouldn't seek it for just selfish gain, but actually you should seek it because you can't seek it apart from the good of your neighbor.
Yeah. I grabbed another article about poverty, studying some of the poorest areas in the country, which we often assume was like inner cities and in some of the big cities. It's not. They're rural areas, and they're almost universally what this author describes as rural areas that were the world capital of something once upon a time. So Greenwood, Mississippi was the cotton capital of the world. Crystal City, Texas was the spinach capital of the world. Manchester, Kentucky had been the salt capital of the northeastern United States before it became a coal mining region.
That's a little specific.
Yeah, some of them are very specific. Marion County, South Carolina was the tobacco capital of that region. These are now some of the poorest places on earth. And they say what we realized in looking at these places, all of these places had been grounded in a small group of white elite who established a single industry and then began exploiting, either through slavery or other practices, huge numbers of poorly paid, barely surviving laborers to create vast wealth. And because of that, because that's how those areas were settled, they were settled to set up an industry to benefit a few at the expense of many. They didn't set up equitable education systems in those areas because they didn't want to teach everybody. Those areas weren't set up for everybody. And that's still there today. So one of the authors of this study says, if you want to find, I can tell you how wealthy or poor a place is by simply measuring. He says, I can predict with a ton of precision today's poverty rate in a place in America based on a small set of factors from 100 to 200 years ago, including the level of segregation, the number of lynchings, and the number of people enslaved. So these things, they persist.
Yeah.
And it's what you see in these cultures. When there was an area that was set up with a culture of education is for a few, the fruit of the labor is for a few, not for the many, you still see the impact of that 200 years later.
I mean, this is where history becomes really important, because there's been a lot of data that shows as the gap between the wealthy and the poor grows wider and wider, and fewer people hold more and more of the wealth, you destabilize society. I mean, how many monarchs had to have their heads lopped off in Europe before they figured out that it's not great when you're living in the lap of luxury and everyone else is starving outside the palace. It doesn't go well. And the fact that those inequalities carry on for generations, it's kind of an affirmation of what the Lord said to Moses in Exodus 34, talking about the sins of the parents going on to the third and fourth generation. Like, we can make really bad decisions that persevere through history, that reverberate through history, which is part of the reason why, as God's people, we are also to seek to undo those things by correcting wrongs from the past. And that gets into the whole conversation around reparation and social justice and these other things, which, to Caitlin's point, isn't just about the present generation paying for the sins of past generations. It's about the present generation repairing the damage of past generations so that all of us can move ahead in a healthy, thriving way. And it isn't just good for those who've been most wronged. It's even good for those who are doing okay today to ensure the ongoing health and perseverance of society.
Yeah.
But we don't tend to talk about it that way because we're too hyper individualistic in our
And so you've got a lot
imaginations.
of this in MAGA world, where you see appeals to the natural order and appeals to, we were here first and we're losing our influence and we're getting the short end of the stick, and we're supposed to have the long end of the stick because we're the true Americans. It's all about the true Americans. Who are the true Americans? We need to do something. I'm not as optimistic as you, Sky, that some demographic changes are going to take care of all this. And
No. I don't think it disappears.
A few years.
I'm just arguing when it comes to what form does the Christian church in America take?
Yeah.
I don't see white Southern evangelicalism or white Southern fundamentalism as being ascendant. I think it's declining. I just think as it declines, it's becoming much more aggressive culturally and politically. Yeah. But it's not the demographically growing part of the American church.
Caitlin, agree or disagree?
I think I agree, but also at risk of sounding just like overly pious, I feel like I hear all of this and I'm just like, Jesus is coming back and like everything will be made new and it will be ultimately good.
Okay, but how do we help people until then?
I mean, hearing this, I imagine a lot of people listening are thinking not just of an abstract Southern Christian person, but of a family member or someone in their church. And I do think there is this dynamic that you should be very aware of this is true across cultures and different times. We see it in scripture a lot. When someone's power is declining, as Sky described, they want to lash out. We're not without resources, though. I mean, I was being kind of glib about Jesus coming back, but I do really think one of the greatest political theology resources we have for this is really teaching people about the truth of the resurrection and what the end of all things looks like, which is a diverse community that God is present with. And it says in Isaiah, the kings of all the nations bringing their good gifts into the New Jerusalem. And so I think sometimes we want to respond to these kinds of dynamics with, let's just hash it out at Thanksgiving with our aunt who thinks this crazy stuff and posts wild Facebook statuses. And I wonder if instead it's like, Well, for 5 years, we spent a lot of time talking about what justice looks like in Scripture. We spent a lot of time talking about the stability that we actually have. We don't have to be afraid. We know what the end is like. We believe in the resurrection of the body. And actually, they're beautiful descriptions of the diverse community of God, praising God in eternity altogether. And not that you don't sometimes have to confront someone with the truth of what they are saying and the harm it causes people. But I think sometimes some of us are going to spend many years just in like the weeds of some basic theology, hoping that eventually penetrates the hearts of people who have often been really much more deeply shaped by the media consumption that is invested in making them anxious and afraid.
Unfortunately, we gave all our grandparents internet access to reduce their odds of dementia. And now the chickens have come home to roost. Okay, we have a new mini-series coming up that you are going to love, and we actually made a trailer for it. So we're going to play you the trailer. Here it is. I think there are quite a few people in our audience standing at the back door of their church saying, just give me one good reason not to walk out.
I was really dark about the future of the church.
I just kept running up against Christians who were awful.
People were just up in arms, how dare you? And I was like, what is happening right now?
Donald Trump tweeted about your very dark heart.
Yes, nasty, nasty man with no heart.
I assume you didn't think at the time that criticizing Trump would turn out to be as big a deal as it turned out to be.
Oh, no, I knew exactly how big a deal it was. Yeah.
I didn't set out to write a book about the dark side of American evangelicalism.
I would say things like, we got to take care of the poor. Amen, brother. We got to take care of the disenfranchised. Amen, brother. And we should speak up about these unarmed black people getting killed in the streets. Hold on, brother.
Oh, in the silence of despairing, in the waking, in the night.
Of course, I'm done with this whole thing. I'm out of here.
You can say what you want about me or make the claims and call me a wolf or a heretic or a false teacher, Honestly, sometimes it's exhausting to have to prove myself to other Christians that I'm a Christian.
That sense of exile, it was very hard for that part of me not to hear, "Depart from me, you worker of iniquity, I never knew you."
Lecrae,
Kristen Dumais,
Jamar Tisby, Russell Moore. Why are you still a Christian?
Why I'm Still a Christian, a Holy Post subseries premiering September 18th.
Huh? That sounds cool, huh? That's coming up in a few weeks. Stay tuned for it. And thank you, Caitlin. Thank you, Sky. Everybody have a great week. Thanks for listening. Come to Holy Post Plus at holypost.com and check out all the cool stuff that Caitlin and Sky and Christian are making for your dining pleasure. And keep your grandparents off the internet. See you later. Bye. Today's episode is sponsored by Sundays. This is Phil. I have a dog. You have a dog. We love our dogs, and we gotta feed them something. Fresh food with human-grade ingredients is a better way to treat our dogs than that old bag of whatever that stuff is. Sawdust and cow bones? I have no idea. But fresh pet food is expensive and inconvenient, and that's where Sundays comes in. No, not the day. The new dog food company that makes air-dried dog food from a short list of human-grade ingredients. It's healthy, with beef, chicken, and digestive aids like pumpkin and ginger. It's convenient. Unlike other fresh dog foods, it's zero prep, zero mess, and zero stress. Sundays is shelf-stable and ships right to your door. And it's affordable, costing 40% less than other healthy dog food brands because they don't waste money shipping frozen packages. We've got a special offer for our dog-loving Holy Posters. Get 35% off your first order of Sundays. Go to sundaysfordogs.com/holypost or use the code HOLYPOST at checkout. That's sundaysfordogs.com/holypost. Upgrade your pup to Sundays and feel good about the food you feed your dog. And thanks to Sundays for sponsoring this episode.
This episode is being sponsored by AG1 by Athletic Greens. Some of you know that my dad is a doctor, and as I get older, he's always telling me to watch my weight and exercise regularly. But in the last few years, he's also been telling me to pay attention to my gut health. He's been persuaded by all the research saying that the biome of good bacteria that lives in our guts is critical to our long-term health. There's just one problem. I hate taking lots of pills and vitamins and supplements. And why do they always have to be so big? That's one of the reasons I was excited to try AG1 by Athletic Greens. AG1 is a foundational nutritional drink with 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food ingredients. I take it first thing in the morning before I've had my tea and before I jump into my morning routine of writing my daily devotional. And I'll be honest, it tasted way better than I expected. I've been doing it for a few weeks now, and I feel great knowing I'm supporting my health and not having to gag down a bunch of giant pills every morning. And that's why I've stuck with it, because AG1 is a super easy daily habit. So, if you're looking for a simpler and cost-effective supplement routine, check out AG1 by Athletic Greens. And right now, Athletic Greens is giving you a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Go to athleticgreens.com/holypost. That's athleticgreens.com/holypost. We talk a lot on the Holy Post about the way partisan politics and culture war issues are dividing the church and driving more and more people away from Christian faith. But Christianity isn't the only faith being impacted by these trends. Incredibly, they're also causing deep divisions within the New Atheism movement as well. And as that movement has fractured, it's created a new curiosity and openness to the claims of Christianity among some academics and intellectuals. Justin Brierley has observed the rise and fall of the New Atheism movement from his seat as the host of the Unbelievable podcast that's brought together believers and skeptics to debate theology, science, and philosophy for years. Apart from his role in the UK as a broadcaster, author, and speaker, Justin is also a Holy Post pundit. And his new book is called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God: Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Reconsidering Christianity Again. As you'll hear in our conversation, the openness to Christian faith he's seen among secular intellectuals is really incredible, and it may represent a real cultural turning point. But there's a shadow side. It's unclear whether this new interest in Christian faith is fueled by a genuine curiosity about Jesus or simply a practical desire for political and cultural power. Either way, I can't think of anyone better to help us understand these trends than Justin Brierley. Justin Brierley, welcome back to the Holy Post.
Thank you so much, Sky. It's great to be back with you.
Yeah, I've followed you for years, obviously. Loved all the things you produced with Premiere and Unbelievable. Now you're doing a lot of new projects on your own, including this latest book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God: Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. There are so many books coming out right now that are bad news about what's going on in the church and the culture, the decline of church attendance, all kinds of, we have those kinds of speakers and that data featured often on the show, but it's nice to find some good news.
Yeah.
So was that part of what motivated you to put this book together, was just wanting to fill the gap with some hope? Or I know this is coming out of your own experience with a lot of thinkers, but
I guess I am in some ways a optimistic kind of person generally. So I've tended to see good where other people perhaps only see, a complete picture of decline and so on. I am aware that we've lived through several years now of kind of fairly bad news stories, grim things, especially in the evangelical church subculture. But what I was noticing was that actually there was also interesting positive developments happening, particularly the way the conversations were changing, the ones that I was hosting through my Unbelievable show and that kind of thing. And I just felt there was a different story potentially to be told. That's not to say there's not still a lot of bad stuff going on, but I felt there was a kind of an interesting undercurrent as well that was worth spelling out.
yeah, and you covered that really wonderfully, and you have access to so many of these thinkers, and especially the academics and intellectuals that are asking different questions or challenging different ideas than they did just a few years ago. But let's go back, because the early part of your book focuses on the rise and fall of New Atheism, which was a world that I touched on occasionally, but you were very much involved in, and hearing those folks on your podcast and radio program. So you kind of had a closer seat than many of us to this phenomenon. Let's begin here. Who were the four horsemen of New Atheism, and why did they become so prominent in that movement?
Yeah, it was a slightly pretentious sort of name for these four folk. I'm not sure that they kind of put themselves forward for these roles exactly, but they were certainly associated with it. So you had the philosopher Daniel Dennett, you had the sort of journalist and popular polemicist Christopher Hitchens, you had the neuroscientist and public thinker Sam Harris, and of course Richard Dawkins, who's well known as a biologist, but was almost seen as the leader of the movement. His book, The God Delusion, was a bestseller back in, I think, 2006. And likewise, all of the other three of these sort of leaders of the movement also had their own best-selling anti-God books. So that kind of was around when the movement started, when these books suddenly became these best-selling hits.
Yeah, and that coincided with the years just following the 9/11 attacks here in the States. What's the correlation between 9/11 and the rise of New Atheism?
I think it's a fairly obvious one, simply that it was a good hook on which these various individuals and the atheist movement in general to start talking about the dangers of religious extremism and fundamentalism. And so obviously Islam was one of the things that they were talking about, but it kind of got generalized generally into the evils of religion, that not thinking for yourself, being told what to think by a set of religious texts was a bad thing, that people needed to be shaken out of that we needed reason, not religion. You know, there was this meme that went around quite a bit around that time, which was religion flies aeroplanes into buildings, science flies people to the moon, you know. And so this was the kind of thing. And what was interesting about it was that it wasn't just, you know, intellectual responses to 9/11. It was very much a kind of quite a visceral kind of reaction, where it was quite sloganeering, it was memes, it was, you know, people ridiculing and making fun of religion. So it came out in quite a different form, and was almost, I think, a reaction, as you know, as I say, to the dangers that were perceived in Islam especially.
Yeah, I remember an incident probably around 2010, 2011, something like that. I was in Southern California with my family, and we were at the beach, and there was a pier, which obviously attracts a lot of people, a big tourist trap. And as we were walking toward the pier, I saw what appeared to be street evangelists on their boxes, holding up signs and a bullhorn and preaching to the crowd. And I expected as we got closer that we were going to hear something about the gospel or some fire and brimstone kind of thing. And as we drew closer, I realized they were actually atheists, and they were holding up posters showing the 9/11 attacks, and they were talking about exactly what you're bringing up, all of the evils of religion, and calling people toward humanism and a post-religious. It was just stunning for me to see secularists and atheists using the tried and true strategies of Christian evangelists to try to push their message. And so go ahead.
I was going to say, and it did take on a sort of slightly religious tone, you know, eventually, the New Atheism, because in the UK there was a sort of the closest thing to an advertising campaign that it had ever had. There were these red London buses bearing these slogans: "There's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life." Likewise, in the US, I think the high watermark really of it was the Reason Rally in 2012, where tens of thousands of people descended on Washington, D.C. to kind of champion reason and science and sort of, you know, declare that they were godless and happy. And you did have, you know, a number of billboard campaigns. Those were not uncommon as well. You know, so it was, and to that extent, I think even secular people started realizing, just as you did, this starts to look a bit evangelistic, starts to look sort of almost religious in and of itself.
Right. From a movement that prided itself on being rational and scientific and naturalistic, it was interesting that they were making very emotional appeals rather than just logical ones. So let's turn the corner then. You symbolically link 2011 as sort of the beginning of the end of New Atheism with an event known as Elevator Gate. Again, not moving in those circles. I was unfamiliar with the Elevator Gate. Can you just, for our audience, explain what that is and kind of why you mark it as the symbolic beginning of the decline?
Yeah, well, every controversy has to have the word gate added to the end of it these days, doesn't
Right.
it? But elevator gate was basically a moment in, I think it was 2011, when a skeptical blogger called Rebecca Watson was attending and speaking at an atheist convention in Dublin. And she had just given a talk on the dangers of misogyny and patriarchy in the atheist movement. She was pointing this out. And after sort of drinks and so on at the bar till the early hours of the morning with other speakers, including Richard Dawkins, who was there, she got into her elevator to go back to her room and was essentially propositioned by one of the people who had attended the conference, would you like to go back to my room for coffee and so on? Well, she declined, but she then did a kind of a video follow-up the following day saying, look, this is the problem with the atheist movement right now. I literally just talked about this issue. And then I get propositioned. I'm a single woman in a foreign country by myself, 4 a.m. This is not on. Okay. Anyway, that might have been the end of it, except that Richard Dawkins then weighed in himself with a very sarcastic response online to this entitled Dear Muslima, in which he parodied her concerns by pretending to be in the voice of a female Muslim who was sort of having all kinds of terrible things occur to her because of her gender, and saying, but don't pity me, pity my poor American sisters being asked for coffee in elevators. Anyway, this just ignited the whole debate. And suddenly there were people who were on Rebecca Watson's side. And this really turned into kind of the movement towards adding things to the atheist movement, that we need to be concerned as well with feminism, LGBT rights, other justice issues. And then the kind of counter to that was kind of siding with the Richard Dawkins side, who were, no, we're just interested in science and reason and common sense. We don't need all these politically correct ideologies added to our movement. And so that was really, I think, was the turning point. It was kind of a Me Too moment, really, for the atheist movement, but that essentially split it in two. And from that point on, I kind of saw it continue to unravel with further debates and controversies over these culture war issues.
Yeah. Going back to the elevator gate thing and Dawkins' response, if I understand what he was saying there, it was essentially a whataboutism argument saying whatever patriarchy and sexism you may have experienced, it's way worse in traditional religious communities, so stop complaining. And I mean, that's obviously an incredibly insensitive and tone-deaf way of responding to what this woman experienced. But you cite later in the book of an atheist blogger who, this is a quote from him or her, I don't know if it's a man or woman, about this split and what happened. They wrote, the atheist community has splintered into a million shards in recent years. There are the atheist feminist and the atheist anti-feminist, the social justice warrior atheist and the anti-social justice warrior atheist, the pro-PC atheist and the anti-PC atheist. There are pro-Trump atheists and anti-pro-Trump atheists. Atheists are split over Gamergate, Elevatorgate, whether we should organize or whether we should even call ourselves atheists at all. The divisions go on and on. I don't want to throw stones at my atheist neighbors, but it is a little gratifying that the church isn't the only community that has these kinds of divisions and infighting. It isn't like if you just get rid of religion, as John Lennon said, you could imagine a world of peace and harmony. Even without religion, we are still humans, and we find our divisions.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Why was that so shattering?
I think the reason it had such an effect that it had was just that I think the naivety almost of part of the movement was sort of shattered in a sense that actually, it turns out that once we've agreed that God doesn't exist and religion is bad for you, it turns out it's hard to find other things to agree on, and it is that human element, as you said, Skye. I think they realized that part of the issues with religion were actually about human issues, not necessarily just tied to the fact of religion. And because even as non-religious people, they were experiencing exactly the same kinds of splits and fallouts and so on. So, and in many ways, I think it's kind of laid the ground for where the movement would eventually go, in fact, because a lot of the adherents and spokespeople for the new atheism ended up essentially taking sides in the culture wars. And in fact, if you kind of look at what most of those main people are doing now, very few of them are really talking about religion or institutional religion anymore. They've all kind of lined up on one side or the other of the culture wars. And so it was just indicative that bigger juggernaut was coming to kind of smash through, the new atheist movement as it developed.
Yeah, you talk about how their attack on fundamentalist religion was sort of replaced with a new kind of fundamentalist religion in the secular form. But before we get into the kind of transition out of the new atheism movement and what it's become, you also talk about new atheism giving the Christian church, you describe as a kick up the backside that it desperately needed. What do you mean by that? What was the kick in the butt that the new atheism movement provided?
Yeah. Here in the UK, we would say a kick up the arse, but I don't know if that's acceptable language in the US or not, Sky. But
it is on the Holy Post.
Okay, that's fine. So I think it was just a helpful actually thing, the new atheism. I do thank God for Richard Dawkins in a way, because actually he forced a church that had, I think, become somewhat lacking in intellectual vigor, actually pick up its theology and apologetics books again, put down its tambourines and guitars for a while. And I think that was needed, because the church does, as you know, have a strong intellectual tradition, but it had, I think, kind of been overcome in the 20th century for a variety of reasons by a more sentimental, experiential aspect to faith. Now, it's not to say that that's not an important part of it, but it felt like that had become the prevailing thing, and that kind of intellectual core, that sort of Catholic intellectual tradition. And even folk from the 20th century like Chesterton and Lewis and others had kind of been sidelined to some extent. So I think it was a really good wake-up call that it suddenly put Christians on their mettle, having to respond to these arguments, because now your young person was just a Google click away from radical skepticism. You couldn't guarantee the nice Christian bubble that people once used to grow up in, and that for me wasn't altogether a bad thing. It actually helped to give people a sense of asking themselves, why do I believe what I believe? And as much as obviously the new atheism reaped a number of deconverts, I think that overall it had quite a fortifying effect on the church in terms of forcing it to up its game.
Do you see that as true both in the UK and the US, or is there a different response across the pond from what we've seen? I think some people would argue that since sort of the decline of new atheism, the church in the US has not been reinvigorated. If anything, the decline is accelerated, not because of atheism or intellectual challenges, but because of politics and cultural hypocrisy within the church. So are they just different things, or do you see them kind of happening under the surface?
Yeah,
both countries.
And when I say reinvigorated, I don't mean to suggest that the church has suddenly become some, marching on to the kingdom just because Richard Dawkins, gave it a kick up the bottom. I think actually there's a whole, obviously you guys know fully the reasons why there's been this particular movement in the church towards politicization and everything else. I do think, though, that it has had a positive effect on certain parts of the church in reinvigorating that intellectual tradition. Just the preponderance now of theological and apologetic resources that were simply not available before the new atheism came into view. I think that was helped and aided by the fact that there was something very significant to respond to in that moment. I mean, there is a difference between the UK and the US. I think the new atheism was essentially driven more by the US than the UK, even though some of its proponents, Dawkins and Hitchens, hail from our shores, because in a sense, we have not had for a long time the kind of Christian majority that has been there in the US. And I think there was more a sense that the new atheism was responding to what it felt was the dangers of a kind of political religious right wing in the US over things like the teaching of creationism in schools and issues like that, which just didn't really exist in the UK in the same way. So it was more a kind of an interesting phenomenon that was observed in the UK. I think it was more lived out to some extent in the USA.
Yeah. From my vantage point over here in the US, it felt like in those years where new atheism was really rising in the 2000s and early 2010s, there was a market dimension of this. These books written by the Four Horsemen and other atheists they were bestsellers. And when there are best-selling books on atheism or trashing belief in God, the Christian marketplace is going to respond by a ton of people writing books reacting to that, and new apologetics and intellectual arguments for the existence of God. And some of them are great, like what Tim Keller and others wrote, and some of them were kind of but there's a market for it. So there's a reaction, and it's not all bad. So I get it. I think it did give us a kick in the pants to address these issues. So let's talk about what's happened since then. New atheism was largely led by academics. I mean, you talk about the Four Horsemen, 3 of whom I think were academics, and 1 journalist. In recent years, it feels like a lot of these free-thinking academics that had been part of New atheism have come to recognize a new threat. They're not necessarily seeing the real danger coming from traditional religious belief. They've shifted to recognize a new danger on the horizon. Describe that danger and why it has gotten their attention.
And I'm going to invoke someone who wasn't one of the Four Horsemen, but who you, I believe, had on the Holy Post in your early days, Sky, Peter Boghossian, who is a well-known sort of academic. He sort of was, up until 2021, professor of philosophy at Portland State University. And he's just such an interesting example of the way that this has changed. I first encountered Peter Boghossian back in, I think, around 2014, when he released his sort of what I think he hoped would be a bestseller in the vein of the God Delusion. It was called A Manual for Creating Atheists, and it was almost exactly what it says on the tin. It was this sort of guide for how to basically talk someone out of their delusional religious beliefs. And when I had him on my show in conversation, go ahead.
If I can interrupt you for a second, because we did have him on our show. We talked about his book, and then Phil somehow got connected with him through social media. They struck up a relationship. Peter Boghossian invited Phil to come out and speak in his class about why he's a Christian. Phil stayed at his home and developed a real friendship. And then he came on our show to talk about that whole dynamic. And it was I should have researched what episode that was in the early years of the Holy Post, but it was a fascinating journey for both of them. And really amazing. So sorry to interrupt, but yeah, that's the history of Boghossian.
Yeah, and in my interactions with Boghossian, I found him to be a very personable person. But what I noticed was that his tone changed dramatically, and maybe it was in the process of changing when you had your interaction with him. But because he had, taken this very strong line, when he wrote this book, that essentially religious belief should be categorized as a mental delusion, literally. But when I approached him only 4 or 5 years later, I think it was 2018, I was coming to Portland. I was putting on a sort of an onstage event, was looking for an atheist to have a conversation. And I emailed him about it. His reply stunned me, because he came back saying, Justin, I'm going to politely decline your invitation because I'm really not, talking or debating God any longer. And the reason for this will become apparent. But he said, essentially, I think of Christians now more as allies very often than as enemies. I've completely changed my thinking, really, around the value of faith. And he said, I think there's a much more sort of worrying enemy on the horizon, and you'll find out more about that. So I was intrigued, and lo and behold, a few months later, it turned out that he, along with some fellow co-conspirators, were behind a sort of hoax set of papers that were submitted to peer-reviewed journals, but they were effectively parodying and sending up what they termed grievance studies. So these were studies that were kind of written in the language of politically correct ideologies around gender and race and sexuality and everything else. But which were kind of putting in quite outlandish theories forward. But because they were written with the right kind of lingo and so on, they were being accepted and published. Well, this ruse got rumbled eventually, and it created quite a controversy and debate around whether academia was being taken over by these politically correct ideologies. And that was their concern, essentially, that actually the bigger enemy to academic freedom and reason was actually from within the academy, not from sort of fundamentalist Christians. And so that was just a huge, interesting turn, a pivot, really, where, someone like Boghossian simply stopped attacking Christians and people of faith and started basically going for his own secular peers who he thought were going in a radically wrong direction. And that for me was one instance, and I've seen that happen in so many cases now where the landscape has changed in that way.
So you mentioned Boghossian saying to you that he viewed Christians as allies more than enemies in the past. And a number of the folks that you highlight in the book, these academics who maybe had been atheist or more secularist, now identify as almost Christian curious. I don't know if you use that term in the book, but they feel Christian curious. But is it a case of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, that they've come to see Christians as allies against a sort of progressive fundamentalism that's taken over the academy? Or is there something more going on? Is there an actual genuine interest in the claims of Christian faith itself? Or is it just, hey, we all have this bigger enemy and I'm going to stop attacking Christians and just welcome them to the fight?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a mixture. And I think in the case of some, it is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. There are people who, are feeling like at least the Christians, even though I, don't agree with the word they say, they provide some kind of bulwark with me against what they see as this threat and so on. And so I think you probably have got a lot of the kind of to use the word anti-woke sort of protesters and people who feel like they've got common cause in that sense. But I think you also do have, that phrase is quite a good one, Christian curious academics and thinkers who are essentially understanding and realizing that the new atheists really did throw the baby out with the bathwater, that by rejecting religion altogether, they failed to see the value that was actually there in the Christian story, the Christian worldview, the heritage that the Christian sort of worldview has given the West. And I'm seeing many of those as well taking a real interest in the Christian story, asking themselves, can we live without something like God? Can we live without something that gives us that kind of sense of meaning and purpose and identity? Because I think a lot of them are understanding that there's what's often being termed a meaning crisis in the West, that as society continues to fracture and become more and more polarized and divisive, that there's very little alternative that's ever worked, and that perhaps will work than the Christian story.
Yeah, that's a significant part of the book that I found really fascinating. You at one point quoted new atheist Douglas Murray, and he said this: "I'm now in the self-confessedly conflicted and complex situation of being, among other things, an uncomfortable agnostic who recognizes the values and the virtues that the Christian faith has brought." And Jordan Peterson is featured very heavily in the book, and his fascinating journey, both towards celebrity status as well as his maybe Christian curious posture. But a number of these folks, including Peterson, clearly values religion and maybe even specifically Christian faith, but it's often valued for pragmatic reasons. They've come to recognize its benefit to society, the heritage that we've been given from its impact throughout, especially Western history. And they've also acknowledged, many of them, the risk of abandoning that entirely, that when you just erase religion and erase the Christian values and virtues that have saturated our society, it's not necessarily better. My question is, does that lead to another danger? Because I've heard very similar arguments from Christian nationalists here in the United States, and their argument is very rarely about the virtues of Christ himself or the virtues of sincere communion with Christ. They're advocating often the cultural, political, social value of Christendom, of keeping this Western tradition of Christian culture alive, apart from any true adherence to the gospel or communion with Christ. Is that one of the things that could develop here from this new Christian curious academic movement?
I think it absolutely could. And I think there is some overlap, actually, between what you've described in the Christian nationalism, because the reality is that a lot of the folk who are kind of recognizing the value and virtues of the Christian inheritance are also, ideologically probably more right-wing, they are more conservative, they are more anti-woke and all the rest of it. And that's perhaps to be expected because, that they are inevitably more about conserving things and about sort of tearing things down and, changing everything. But at the same time, I think you're right that it can easily become just another kind of politicized movement. Absolutely. And the reality is, I talk in the book about the fact that there are a number of these thinkers who can see the kind of psychological and cultural benefits of Christianity, but they're treating it, as you say, like a kind of useful fiction. But of course, I don't have to subscribe to that myself. But if the hoi polloi want to believe it and it helps society to get along, then bravo. And I think that unfortunately can be the kind of supercilious attitude that comes from that quarter. The problem for me is that they've got it the wrong way around, effectively. Christianity isn't sort of metaphorically true because it works. I think it works because it is literally true. And so to that extent, anyone who wants to have the benefits and fruits of Christianity, I don't think ultimately you're going to get it unless you are a Christian. And that means obviously everything that entails in terms of it being centered around Christ, not around some political institution or movement and so on. So I think you're absolutely right to point that out, that it's easy. These things in a purely human capacity can easily go off in directions that are not necessarily Christian in the end, and that's something we need to be very aware of.
How do you see this more ivory tower interest, this revival of interest among academics and intellectuals in Christianity? How do you imagine that trickling down to the population, to the average person inside? We saw New Atheism do that because you had these luminaries write these very popular books that ended up influencing a lot of conversations in churches and ministries. Are you beginning to see that happen in the other direction with Christianity being of interest in the ivory tower, and how is that manifesting itself?
I mean, New Atheism did a really good job of kind of doing the popular level kind of communication, and so and it's still, even though as a kind of cultural movement, it's rather passé now. You still see that all the time if you just get into a Facebook discussion with someone, or the comments on YouTube or whatever. New Atheism is in a sense alive and well in the comment section, but at the same time, this new movement, I would say, it does still, to some extent, it does exist in that slightly more academic, slightly more rarefied sort of place. I think that, having said that, the fact that we now exist in a YouTube podcast kind of world means that it's a lot easier for those messages to filter down than perhaps it used to be. And I think the birth of that stuff was also partly why the New Atheism took off in the way it did. I would say that in terms of books, I'd say you've got something like Jordan Peterson, his best-selling book 12 Rules for Life. What's interesting about that is that it was a huge bestseller, and it's stuffed with references to the Bible. It's full of this stuff. Now, it's not a kind of it's not an evangelical sort of text by any means, because it does have this sort of sense of it's about the psychological usefulness of Christianity and everything else. But at the same time, I've met a lot of people for whom people like Peterson and others have become a sort of gateway drug to Christianity. So even if those thought leaders, if you like, haven't made the step themselves, they've kind of opened the door. They've made it intellectually feasible for other people to walk through it, because they've just been given the permission to take this seriously. And when they have, they've found that actually it seems to make sense to them. They're able to walk through that door. And I think there is that trickle-down effect, because these are people with huge platforms, reaching millions of people through podcasts and YouTube or events or whatever it might be. And while it's obviously all mixed up as well with quite a lot of the politicization that swirls around in those kinds of discussions, I do see people who have come out of it, saying, actually, I am kind of a convert from this phenomenon. I've actually, now, whether that will become a sort of significant movement of people remains to be seen, but I have seen at least some evidence that it is actually reaching people on the ground in that way.
Yeah, I'm very curious to watch this unfold, because I am having conversations with people who are generally secular in their outlook, who are coming to recognize the bankruptcy of that worldview and some of the abuses that are happening on the extreme kind of more fundamentalist left, what people might call the ultra woke left. And they are intrigued by the Jordan Petersons and some of these other figures that are either Christian curious or pro-religion. My question is, does that curiosity ultimately lead people to faith in Christ, or does it lead them simply to the alt-right and an embrace of cultural religion as a way of giving the middle finger to the secularists on the far left? And if that's the big question, is which way does it go? And then it's going to be different for different people. Before we wrap up here, I'd love you to share a little bit about your experience with Tom Holland, not the Spider-Man actor, the historian and author of Dominion, because I think he kind of represents or exemplifies this journey of intellectuals toward an embrace of Christian faith that might begin with being Christian curious and recognizing the value through history. But what has been his journey as far as you can tell, and how does it represent this whole phenomenon?
Tom Holland is a really interesting person. He co-hosts probably the most popular history podcast in the world, The Rest is History. And he wrote this best-selling book, Dominion, which was published in 2019, which was all about the way that the Christian Revolution shaped the West effectively. And it is, to some extent, a slightly autobiographical work, because he talks in that book about the way that he grew up kind of with a vague kind of Anglican faith growing up, but it sort of fizzled out by his teenage years. And he essentially was a sort of agnostic, secular person as he went to university. And he just sort of, along with all of his peers, just assumed that the values and virtues of the West were just a kind of result of reason and science and Enlightenment thinking and so on. It was only when he began his career writing popular historical works on the Greeks and the Romans that he realized, as he put himself in the shoes of that time and place, how alien their way of life and their values and their virtues were to his own. And he realized, I didn't get my beliefs in freedom, dignity, equality, human rights, sexual consent, all of those things from the Romans and the Greeks. Where did it come from? And he became convinced, as he continued his studies, that it was the Christian Revolution that birthed all of these things, that essentially became categorized and formalized it through medieval church and so on, right through to the modern day. And so he's been very influential as a secular figure, as a kind of public intellectual, talking about this and actually challenging many secular humanists and so on to say, look, don't you realize that the things you believe in are actually kind of an article of faith? They are sort of theological concepts, essentially. You didn't get these from some sort of science, reason, enlightenment sort of process. They are specifically tied to this person, Jesus Christ, and this quite extraordinary claim that he was God incarnate, but he suffered this slave's death. And this was the basis for what your belief in compassion and sacrifice, and because these things did not exist in the world that Jesus entered. They were not the norm in the way that we just take them absolutely for granted today. So he's been on a fascinating journey. I've had the pleasure of engaging him in several discussions, both with people who are very sympathetic to that, people like N.T. Wright, but also some of these secular humanists like A.C. Grayling, who's a well-known atheist philosopher here in the UK, who they had a real barnstorming debate on my show. But again, just a fascinating character who I think exemplifies the way that the conversation is beginning to change in this way.
Well, Justin, thank you for being with us and for this excellent book. Like I said at the beginning, it does give me hope that despite the decline and frankly the perversion of so much Christianity, at least on this side of the pond, that there are these genuinely curious intellectuals who are recognizing the benefit not just of Christian faith and culture, but personal faith in Christ and the strength of it. The book is called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God: Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. And thank you for your ongoing work with your shows and podcasts and other resources you're producing. You've been a rallying point for so many intellectually curious Christians and non-Christians to engage in really good dialogue. You're one of the best hosts I've ever heard at making people from across the spectrum feel welcomed and valued, and keep up the good work. And we'd love to have you back anytime.
Oh, that's really kind. I was so glad to be asked to be a Holy Post pundit as well recently. So I'm really looking forward to being involved in the Holy Post at some point in the future on that level. But yeah, I always say this every time we speak, Sky, but the Holy Post, I listen to it every single week. It's kind of the way I keep in touch with the crazy ups and downs of US evangelicalism. But I really appreciate it because it's always a lesson in kind of what's going on, and you guys are such a voice of sanity and fun as well along the way. So I'm a huge fan, and thank you for having me on the show today.
Absolutely, anytime. We're grateful to have you as part of the team.
The Holy Post podcast is a production of Holy Post Media. Production assistance by Mike Strelo. Editing by Area Code Audio. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by subscribing to Holy Post Plus at holypost.com/plus. Also, be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much more.